This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this roundtable edition of Where Did the Road Go? I'm here with Aaron David of Charm the Water.
Hello.
Red Pill Junkie.
Delighted to be here.
And Timothy Renner of Strange Familiars.
Glad to be back.
And on this show, we're going to be talking about something that may not seem like it's relevant, but when I read this, I thought, this is really relevant, and I sent it to you guys, and I think Tim's the only one who didn't see it, because I don't know why. It may have, you either missed it or I posted it to our group before you were part of it. But it's, and you all kind of agreed that, yeah, there's a lot of stuff here that we can kind of springboard off, and it's a actual article in, let me see here, Frontiers in Psychology. And it's 50 psychological and psychiatric terms to avoid, a list of inaccurate, misleading, misused, ambiguous, and logically confused words and phrases. And it's been put together by a number of people. One of them I just noticed is from Binghamton University, which is only like an hour and a half from here, about an hour south of Ithaca. And it says, the goal of this article is to promote clear thinking and clear writing among students and teachers of psychological science by curbing terminological misinformation and confusion. Jeez. And basically what it is they take some terms that are thrown around pretty easily, and they kind of get down to where the science actually is on these things. And this affects a lot of the stuff we deal with, because a lot of what we deal with does affect, has to do with consciousness, has to do with perception, has to do with all kinds of stuff in this level. When you're dealing with fringe stuff, it's psychology is part of it. There's no way around it. So we're going to start with the first term, and we're not doing all 50, because not all 50 need to be done, and we're probably not going to get through more than a few in this show. So we'll just start with number 1, which is the term a gene for. And it says, the news media is awash in reports of identifying genes for a myriad of phenotypes, including personality traits, mental illnesses, homosexuality, and political attitudes. For example, in 2010, the Telegraph trumpeted the headline, liberal gene discovered by scientists. Nevertheless, because genes code for proteins, there are no genes for phenotypes per se, including behavioral phenotypes. Let me see if I can talk. Moreover, genome-wide association studies of major psychiatric disorders, such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, suggest that there are probably few or no genes of major effect. In this respect, these disorders are unlike single-gene medical disorders, such as Huntington's disease or cystic fibrosis. The same conclusion probably holds for all personality traits. Not surprisingly, early claims that the monoamine oxidase A gene is a warrior gene have not withstood scrutiny. This polymorphism appears to be only modestly associated with risk for aggression, and it has been reported to be associated with conditions that are not tied to a markedly high risk of aggression, such as major depression, panic disorder, and autism spectrum disorder. The evidence for a God gene, which supposedly predisposes people to mystical or spiritual experiences, is arguably even less impressive. And they actually cite a paper from Shermer on this. And no more compelling than that for a God spot in the brain, which is also addressed in this article. Incidentally, the term gene should not be confused with the term allele. Genes are stretches of DNA code for a given morphological or behavioral characteristic, whereas alleles are differing versions of a specific polymorphism in a gene. I understood 99% of that, but there's a little bit of stuff in there that was a little deep for me, because I'm not, I'm not even sure from that description what an allele is. But the important part is the idea that, there could be a God gene. for instance, is really fascinating and, according to this, not supported at all.
Mm-hmm. I was just listening to a podcast, and they were talking about how we can get designer children with, we can do eye color, and they've identified what controls height. And they were talking about in the near future how it's going to be the rich people who start having, designer children, and it's going to create a big rift because there's going to be, more intelligent and stronger, more healthy. And like you reading this, I'm like, I don't know if we have this down exactly. I think that may be a utopian sort of delusion. I don't think a lot of what makes humans are in the genetics, like for personality wise. So we might end up with beautiful, stupid people like in H.G. Wells' Time Machine.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like the fallacy of what we were promised in the 90s with the Human Genome Project. Remember, when it was compared to the Apollo program in a way, these big scientific endeavors to try to map the entirety of the human genome. And after that was completed, they said back in those days that there were going to be all sorts of benefits for mankind, including, customized gene therapies for people, and also to they will be able to identify the gene responsible for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and many other illnesses that still affect us, right? But then what happened? First, okay, it was completed, and it was obviously a huge and it was a groundbreaking achievement. First, it was discovered that the human genome wasn't really that big as expected. Actually, in fact, they realized that the human genome is almost smaller than that of other species. And then there was also all these what they call back in those days garbage DNA. Now I guess the appropriate term for it is non-coding DNA. But then again, the idea that we don't really know what the hell those genes are for. Some people say, well, there are like remnants that are left out by evolution, kind of like the genetic equivalent of the appendix. But in the end, what happened is that scientists learned there's no such thing as a single gene that is responsible for an illness or a trait expressed in the human organism, and then came kind of like the revenge of Lamarck with how we learned that the environment has a huge influence in how the genes are expressed. So different genes can be expressed, can be turned on and off depending on environmental conditions that are really out of our control. So bottom line, what scientists learn is that genetics are in a way simpler and then much more difficult or much more complex than we realize. So that's why those ideas that there was going to be some kind of gene that we will be able to locate and then to try to eradicate, much more like the fiction of the island of Dr. Moreau. It's a complete fallacy, and we are in right now in trying to figure out what to do, and so that's when epigenetics and other factors are coming into play, and in a way it's really exciting, because in a way it's kind of like back to the drawing board.
Yeah, and it throws a monkey wrench in sort of the materialistic view of things to some degree.
True. Yeah.
Because they were all like, we got it all figured out. It's we're gonna know everything, and then we still don't know anything.
Yeah.
And like I said, they cite a paper from Michael Shermer talking about the God gene, which they're saying doesn't, there's really nothing to support it.
Yeah. In a way, I feel that's going to be the same thing with this other big government and public and private endeavor, that kind of like not a sequel to the Human Genome Project, but kind of like the next big thing after it, which is this plan to try to map the entirety of the human brain in order to create the most accurate computerized model of the human brain possible. And this is obviously, again, the idea that once we manage to do that, we're going to finally figure out how consciousness is generated by the brain, and how then we're going to be able to create sentient artificial intelligence and on all of that. I suspect that they're going to find themselves in a similar situation to the people who were in charge of the Human Genome Project, that they're going to finally map the human brain, but then they're still going to be scratching their heads and say, well, we have it all mapped out, but we still don't know how the hell consciousness arise from this group of neurons.
Yeah.
I think it's a really exciting time for scientific discovery, and that we're finding out things aren't as simple as we thought they were, and older ideas are being challenged. We're finding out the microbiome is important, gut flora, all these factors, like you're talking about, all these different variables. But it's like kind of funny, the idealization of, oh, if we can just get this mapped out, we'll understand everything. It's almost like a little carrot being dangled, that idealization drives us forward and making us want to get to there. But I mean, for me, it's not disappointing at all. It's what actually is being discovered is so much more complex and so much more beautiful than what we thought. So it's really exciting that these discoveries are coming about, and challenging the thinking that we know everything. There's nothing new under the sun. Excuse me.
Okay. Tim, did you have anything to add?
Just in terms of the God gene they're talking about, and in terms of the things we usually talk about in the paranormal and so forth, I think it's really interesting, because I think we tend to, and not we in general, I mean, we specifically in the show, I mean, we in general, we in the paranormal, tend to sometimes associate people who experience things coming from certain gene pools. And in other words, people will list, well, he's of Romani descent, or this person's of Native American descent. And I think that's kind of, in the paranormal world, we sometimes do what Spike Lee calls the magical black man thing with people who come from these, certain cultures that have an air about them. But I think it probably, if we looked into it, it has more to do with the culture than it does with the genetics.
Yeah. And the thing is, even with genetics, I mean, you keep seeing these advertisements where people, like I saw one tonight briefly where someone was like, I thought I was German, but I did I think it was Ancestry.
What is real name?
And I found out I was 65% Scottish, or something like that. And it's like, well, that's part of it right there. And
yeah, I was absolute same thing happened to me. We had a family legend growing up that we were Native American. It was sort of kind of one of these known things. And I think this happens a lot to a lot of families. And I had my DNA tested, and there's absolutely none there. I came out 50% Viking, which was, I had no clue. Like, there's none of that in the sort of family history, except a lot of my ancestors come from Ireland, so we figure Viking settlements were in Ireland. So of my ancestors that came from Ireland were probably Vikings. I suppose.
So you don't indulge into a bit of pillaging here and there occasionally?
Well, I just found out, so I feel like it's now I have.
And there was also these 3 identical twins, all born, identical at the same time, et cetera, who all have different DNA.
Yes.
Mhm.
We found that too, because my father-in-law does genealogy, so he has paid for all of us to do these DNA tests, and my wife's sister comes up different than my wife, and she comes up different than her parents. So,
but these were identical twins. They look exactly the same, but their genetics were different.
Yep.
I did the 23andMe thing, and the results were surprising to me. I had the same thing, Tim, that was sort of known, that we were part Native American. Both sides claimed that, mom and dad's. And what I found interesting from the results was since a kid, I was always interested in Luther, the writings of Luther, Calvin. Like in my teenage years, I started getting into that stuff. And then even the occult stuff, the Renaissance period, occultism, kind of was drawn to that. And then I get my DNA test, and it's like 99.9% Northern European, where all this stuff I was interested in was sort of situated. And I'm like, that's interesting.
Okay. I'm going to jump up to number 10, which is the God spot, because I feel that makes more sense to continue on with that one.
The old G-spot.
And that says, seizing on functional imaging findings that religious ideation is associated with activations in specific brain regions, such as circumscribed areas of the temporal lobe, some media and academic sources have referred to the discovery of a God spot in the human brain. Such language is scientifically dubious, given that the complex psychological capacities, including religious experiences, are almost surely distributed across several sprawling networks that themselves encompass multiple brain regions. Not surprisingly, studies of people undergoing mystical experiences have reported activation in many brain areas, including the temporal lobe, caudate, inferior parietal lobe, and insula. As one researcher observed, there is no single God spot localized uniquely in the temporal lobe of the human brain. The same absence of localization specificity holds for claims regarding the identification of other purported brain regions, such as an irony spot or a humor spot.
Well, these people do not know about the pineal gland, where all that mystical stuff is.
So that is, but that's again one of those materialist arguments that, well, when you have a spiritual experience, it's just all in the brain. We know the spot that gets activated.
Right. Yeah. I saw, and I'm not a huge fan of TED Talks, but I saw a woman who had gone through a lot of shamanic training do a TED Talk, and she had MRIs done before and during entering shamanic states, MRIs of her brain. Uh-huh. And in when she hit that shamanic trance state, the whole brain fired up, like not areas all over the brain, not one specific brain.
Yeah, and there have been monks who have been on MRI machines, and they say their entire brain fires up in ways they've never seen in a normal person.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
I've also heard different types of meditation. Some brain going completely dead, as if they were dead.
Yeah, I've heard of that too. It doesn't mean that this stuff isn't somehow all in the brain, but it's not that simple if it is.
Right.
And if the brain's going, if brain waves are going completely dead, then that's, and they're still having an experience, it's kind of like a near-death experience.
Mm-hmm.
Brain waves, but the brain is dead, it has stopped working, and they can still tell you what's going on in the room while they're dead.
It's because they have scanned the brains of people under the influence of psilocybin mushrooms and other psychedelics, and instead of what would you expect that the brain will be firing up because of the influence of the drug. It's kind of the opposite, that the brain is quieted down. So in a way, you could argue that the brain is not a generator of activity or ideas or thoughts, but it's kind of like a mediator. So when the mediator is kind of like knocked down, then that's when you are free to experience other inputs that is usually probably disregarded by your conscious attention.
There was an article, let's see if I can find it right here, but it was talking about, yes, the brain's 15-second delay shields us from hallucinogenic experience.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was on RT, which is not the greatest source for information, but they're basically saying that this stuff is filtered out, that it's there normally, but it's filtered out. And our brain just kind of filters it out naturally so we can function better in the real world.
Yeah, there was this guy, it was quoted by both Greg Bishop and Robert Brandstetter, my colleagues in UFO Reframing the Debate. This guy who made a theory of an evolutionary theory of perception, how the idea of the brain will only select input, from the environment, the ones that will be vital for the survival of the organism. So it will favor detecting, movement in your periphery of sound of something, rustling around you, because that could be a predator that is going to, in the process of attacking you and killing you, right? But it will disregard other input that is also present in the environment, but maybe it's not that pressing for the survival of the organisms. And maybe, there are some members of the species in which those fight or flight tendencies are not as high-tuned or have different, priorities. And maybe those are the individuals who are maybe able to detect things that are out there in the environment and most of the people, are not aware of. And those are the people that in our culture are called schizophrenics, insane people who are hearing voices. And obviously those are the people that we in the West tend to lock up, because they are deluded. Whereas in other cultures, those are the people who are praised as having some kind of contact with the other side, with other levels of existence. And those are the people who are, called or are regarded as shamans.
I was hearing today about a guy he's an artist, kind of like a psychedelic artist, and he actually sees what he draws, and this all started with him getting a concussion, and it damaged his eyes. So his explanation of what happened was that this alteration in his eyes allowed him to take in more of what's actually there. So he started seeing these serpentine astral things crawl up walls and stuff, and they were in 3D. It wasn't like it was a hallucination put over reality, but it was actually moving in 3D like it was in reality itself. And it kind of struck me as really interesting. What I thought of was, number one, my own experience with Goat after seeing him later in a dream state. My right eye fell out, which kind of made me look into the Eye of Ra and Eye of Horus. And Egyptians were cutting a lot of brains open, probably, taking them out. And what is it? The thalamus and hypothalamus, it looks exactly like the Eye of Ra, or depending I think it's eye of Ra is the right eye, eye of Horus is the left eye, or vice versa.
Hmm.
So
And isn't there saying with Odin as well, losing an eye for knowledge?
yes,
Yes.
he sacrificed it. So this eye symbolism, and obviously it was very important to the Egyptians. I think it's likely that's where the eye of Ra came from. I mean, them dealing with brains and mummies so much that they saw this as a center of something. I don't know enough about the mythology, but it seems to be there in the human psyche. I think of Alex Gray's, is it his psychedelic artwork with the eyes all around?
Mm.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I think that's sort of a symbolism for sort of the reality we perceive, and kind of that poking out. I don't know. I had my right eye fall out. If it's something's altered in your perception, it allows you to take more in. And that filter kind of is taken away some. I don't know. Am I making any sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll say yes.
I went all over the place right there, but
All right, let's move on to the next one, which is relevant to something we just talked about a few weeks ago. The number 2 thing on the list is antidepressant medication. And of course, we did our Dark Night of the Soul episode, and it says here, medications such as tricyclics and selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and selective serotonin and
Norepinephrine.
thank you. Reuptake inhibitors are routinely called antidepressants. Yet there is little evidence that these medications are more efficient. I love that they have to use the biggest words possible.
Of course.
More useful for treating or preventing relapse for mood disorders than for several other conditions, such as anxiety-related disorders, for example, panic disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, etc., or bulimia nervosa. Hence, their specificity to depression is doubtful, and their name derives more from historical precedents. The initial evidence for their efficacy, I'm not going to be able to say that word, efficacy, stemmed from research on depression than from scientific evidence. Moreover, some authors argue that these medications are considerably less useful than commonly claimed and are beneficial for only severe but not mild or moderate depression, rendering the label of antidepressant potentially misleading. So basically what it's saying is that these things were used are not actually antidepressants, but they do sometimes have an effect to help with depression. But the reason they're called antidepressants is because they were initially used in that research. Not that they're actually doing anything to necessarily stop depression. It's almost like a side effect of the medication is stopping depression in some cases.
I think it's fairly common in the pharmaceutical world, though, in that a lot of times they'll come up with a drug for one thing and end up using it for another. They do that with MS a lot, especially things they don't understand, and they really don't understand depression as much as they'd like to say they do. But MS is another one. I know from experience on that one. A lot of the drugs, the drug I first started taking when I first got diagnosed was used as a cancer drug in the 70s. And the drug I'm currently on was used for something else before too. They just, happened to find out through trial and error that it helps with MS.
Right.
I think that's fairly common.
Yes. Yeah, it totally is.
It's interesting to notice that scientists started to study the use or the properties of the neurotransmitter serotonin out of LSD research. It's because when people were starting to experiment with LSD and started to see, how it affected the brain, then they tried to figure out why, and that's when they discovered the serotonin. What do you call these? The places in the brain where that neurotransmitter is locked in. So in a way, we'll learn about antidepressants out of LSD, which is kind of ironic because nowadays people are talking about microdosing as a very effective way for some people to treat depression.
Yeah.
Mhm. I kind of have an alternative view that pisses a lot of people off, but my view is kind of like, if you're experiencing pain, like that's your body trying to tell you something's not right. And so, I mean, if you've gone through depression, it's very painful and can be debilitating. But I think it's saying, hey, something's not right. And I think what a lot of these drugs are poised to do is make you feel better. But what I'm asking is, what's the outcome on your behavior? Is it making you more creative or more functional as a human, or not? Like, I had a cousin that committed suicide shortly after changing antidepressants, and he was just not functional. He'd been through several different antidepressants in his life, and he was just not functioning as a person. He was just very isolated and just kind of the type to be, in the basement on the couch, just not functioning at all. So I think a lot of these medications are treating the
Symptoms.
The symptom.
yeah, but not doing anything for the person. I think that's why hallucinogenic mushrooms, I think it's really interesting to keep your eye out for the research that's coming out about that. Now, for me, psychedelics, this was when I was way younger, but they threw me into that sort of self-isolation and kind of dark night of the soul at that time. Now, I don't know if that in the long run was good for me or not. It certainly altered my perspective on a lot of things. I know Kelly would probably tell you I need to be on something. I need to be on something now, but I don't know. I think it's a symptom of saying, hey, something's not right in your life, and maybe
Sure.
there's some issues you need to deal with and work through. And I just think throwing something at it to feel better without addressing those issues is not good. I'm scared to death of the doctor. I've not had a checkup in years, so I don't know how these things are being prescribed. If they're prescribed along with therapy, I think that would be awesome. I don't know if that's what happens or not.
Well, that's part of the problem. The family doctor often will just write a prescription for antidepressants. Like, it's nothing. Like, oh, you're feeling sad? Here you go. And I do think that's part of the problem.
I think
and we become like the movie THA 1138. As a society that is kept sedated, in order to keep production, to keep the cogs turning, and I agree completely with Aaron that that sometimes depression is and all these anxieties that we feel are the symptoms of our circumstances. But instead of tackling those circumstances, trying to see the root of our problem, no, we want to keep ourselves sedated in order to keep ourselves productive, to keep ourselves from getting up in the morning and go to work, because we need the money to keep buying those antidepressants. So in order to keep going to work in the morning, and so on and so forth, it's a vicious cycle.
I think
change is very scary for people, so I think some people are willing to take any amount of medication rather than face something that may change.
True.
Yeah.
I think, Tim, you and I were kind of having a little bit of this conversation earlier today. I went on a 2-week vacation and came back, and all of a sudden I realized how unhappy I am in my job. I'm absolutely miserable, and it's making me miserable even when I'm not at work. And I'm thinking of my dad, who spent like 43 years in the same job. And I think that's the problem. Like you said, Red Pill, this isn't supposed to be how we function. This isn't like it's taking our, occult terms. They use stuff like true will or stuff like that. People aren't living life as they should be. Like this, it's just dawned on me, this isn't right, and I don't want to go another week in this rat race.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of to the point where I don't want to go to a psychologist, because I mean, if you go there for therapy, you get a prescription.
Well, it depends on the psychologist.
True.
Yeah, that's true. If I could find a good Jungian psychologist, I would be all up for it. In fact, Israel Regardie, he said, before anybody gets involved in the occult, go in therapy, work through some of your own stuff before you touch this stuff. And so I'm very open to that. You know, but anyway, that's a little bit of my world.
I think Allison would volunteer to be your therapist.
Oh God. Well, yeah, we had an interesting conversation that I don't remember most of. But,
And that's Tim's wife, for anyone who doesn't know.
She's a sharp lady.
Okay, let's go with number 3 on this list. And that's the autism epidemic. And I'm sure this will be controversial to some people who are very convinced about some of this stuff, but enormous effort has been expended to uncover the sources of the, quote, autism epidemic, the supposed massive increase in the incidence and prevalence of autism, now termed Autism Spectrum disorder, over the past 25 years. The causal factors posited to be implicated in this epidemic have included vaccines, television viewing, dietary allergies, antibiotics, and viruses. Nonetheless, there is meager evidence that this purported epidemic reflects a genuine increase in the rates of autism per se, as opposed to an increase in autism diagnoses, stemming from several biases and artifacts, including heightened societal awareness of the features of autism, detection bias is what that's called, growing incentives for school districts to report autism diagnoses, and a lowering of the diagnostic thresholds for autism across successive editions of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Indeed, data indicate when the diagnostic criteria for autism were held constant, the rates of this disorder remained essentially constant between 1990 and 2010. If the rates of autism are increasing, the increase would appear to be slight at best, hardly justifying the widespread claim of an epidemic.
Yes, I think the spectrum is the key, and without casting aspersions, it seems like the wider net you cast, the more attention you can get for the subject.
Sure.
So, and the more money and the more funding. So, in that sense, maybe it's a good thing.
True.
But I do think definitely more people are looped in, and I mean the autism spectrum seems to include everyone from really, really smart, like genius level kids who just have some social problems to some very profoundly, disabled children as well. So it encompasses a lot there, and I think there's probably financial reasons for that, as well as and again, this may be a good thing. It may be good to the more they can get in there, the more money they can get to study it, and maybe the more help they can get. But I do think that's the case.
Okay. I think it's probably the case as well. That's not to say that some of these things may not also be a factor in the number of people who are autistic. I mean, it's hard to say. Of course, the anti-vaccine movement is the most visible of these things. And I know there are a lot of people who think that vaccines have caused their kids to become autistic. And the problem is there's no way to know for sure. I mean, part of the problem is they take these things apart and they say, well, there's this in it and there's this in it. But those things, yeah, if you took them in high dose would be dangerous. But it's all about the amounts of things and how they interact with other things. It's not just their presence that matters.
Yeah.
There's lots of things that are poison if you take too much of them, but if you take them in lesser amounts, they're perfectly healthy for you. So when you have something in a vaccine that's preserving it, and it's in a micro amount that's not actually doing any damage to your body, that it's not relevant that it's in there.
I wish Joshua was on, because I saw something recently comparing the sort of autism diagnosis with what we would have called changelings in the past, and boy,
Really?
did it line up.
Huh.
Yeah, it was really, really interesting. Right down to the most startling thing was that they, mothers often report today that they feel like their child was taken from them overnight by autism.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I don't know if I sent that to Joshua or not. This was just somebody's comment, but it really was interesting.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that, Seriah, you're totally right. What we're saying is kind of like, maybe it's a stupid analogy, but the first Batman movie, remember that spray that the Joker put in different chemicals, and once it was mixed in a certain way, that's when it created a kind of like a toxic outcome.
Right.
But maybe another thing to consider, and maybe this is way too controversial, is the idea that autism is in a way maybe some kind of like evolutionary reaction. Who knows if 1,000 years from now, if a time traveler went to the year 3000 and he will land to any city, and he will find out that everybody on that city will be autistic in the way that he understood the term in his time. I mean,
Right.
who knows? When the first Cro-Magnon started to appear on planet Earth, how they were regarded by the members of the tribe. Maybe they were seen as the weirdos. The members that weren't strong enough, they weren't fast enough, but probably they were smarter than the others, but they weren't able to express it or show it, or maybe it wasn't useful from the circumstances of their tribe, right? So I don't know, maybe, and this is probably something that I started to think about when I saw that video of Grant Morrison giving his, famous lecture at the Sinfo conference, because he was talking about people with, wasn't autistic, he was talking about people with multiple personality disorder.
Right.
And he said, well, those people are seen as defective, but maybe it's because we don't have a place for them in our culture. But what happens if the culture changes, and then maybe those traits become useful, not only useful but become an advantage? And let's think about it. We're talking about the autistic spectrum, right? And under those, the huge blanket of that spectrum are probably some of the most successful programmers and engineers in our world.
Oh, yeah.
Someone like Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg, whatever. People who use that thing or that trait that in other circumstances would have been a great disadvantage, but allow them to focus and to channel their mental energy in order to achieve their goal. Well, in that regard, it was a huge advantage. Granted, maybe in other regards of their personal life, it wasn't so. You could say that people who have Asperger's, and okay, they are successful businessmen and entrepreneurs, but then maybe when it comes to personal relationships, they're don't fare so well.
Right.
So it's kind of a balance, right? I mean, I say that because I suspect that I fall into the Asperger's side of the spectrum.
Really?
I've never been, I've never been that good with personal relationships. Sometimes when I was in work, I was the happiest when they left me alone with the problem that I was landing.
I'm right there with you.
Yeah, me and the problem, and being immersed inside of the problem and me and the computer, and that's when I was the happiest. And if I was listening to a podcast, the worst thing that could happen is if the phone rang, you know. So yeah, I admit I'm something of an Asperger's, and yeah, it hurts you, but then again, you know, it gives you something. Obviously, that would be small consolation for people who have a deeply autistic child, and I have family members who are, you know, are parents of children who are suffering with that. And you know, there's that idea that there's something with things they are discovering about how their immune response to food and toxins, and how there's something with their gut, you know, that might have elicit that autistic reaction. So it's very nebulous right now, you know. But yeah, definitely this idea of the autistic epidemic and the anti-vaccine movement that I see, and I see that solely in the United States, guys. I mean, here in Mexico, there's no such thing. So it's
Right.
to me, it's only isolated in the United States, and I see that, and it pains me, you know, because I see it as a step backward.
Well, you know what you just said, though, with them being with someone who has any kind of autism being maybe more sensitive to things, it's also possible that a perfectly harmless vaccine shot could affect certain people differently. I mean, nothing is perfect. There's no medicine that is 100% safe. So it could be that, yes, every once in a great while it sets off autism in somebody because they're reacting to something in it, but not because it's inherently dangerous in itself.
Yeah.
I I had a family member that was autistic, and he let very few people into his world. But if you were one of the people he let into his world, you saw how completely unique his perceptions were. And it makes me think of the movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman, and how that brought autism to the forefront. And he almost had like superpowers. You know, it was really interesting. But I was reading something that said 1/3 of people with autism remain nonverbal.
Huh.
And how, like, you know, I've had ex-girlfriends also say they think I'm on somewhere on the autistic scale. And I think of Kelly, she puts up with a lot. I have certain behaviors that typically aren't tolerated by a lot of people. I do like to get off by myself, get deep down into something. I don't know. I know what you're talking about with Josh. Tim, did you mention that? And what you said, Red Pill, about this perhaps being some evolutionary thing. I think that's a very interesting idea. I think they have very unique skills and very unique perceptions.
Yeah. All right. The next one here on the list, number 4, as we've been going for a while, we're only up to number 450. That's why I said we're not going to get to all of them.
Well, we jumped to number 10 and then back. So.
Well, that's true. That's true. So we're technically on the 5th one, but it's number 4 in the article. Brain region X lights up. Many authors in the popular and academic literatures use phrases such as brain area X lit up following manipulation Y. This phrase is unfortunate for several reasons. First, the bright red and orange colors seen on functioning brain imaging scans are superimposed by researchers to reflect regions of high brain activation. Nonetheless, they may engender a perception of illumination in viewers. Second, the activations represented by these colors do not reflect neural activity per se. They reflect oxygen uptake by neurons and are at best indirect proxies of brain activity. Even then, this linkage may sometimes be unclear or perhaps absent. Third, in almost all cases, the activations observed on brain scans are the products of subtraction of one experimental condition from another. Hence, they typically do not reflect the raw levels of neural activation in response to an experimental manipulation. For this reason, referring to a brain region that displays little or no activation in response to an experimental manipulation as a dead zone is similarly misleading. Fourth, depending on neurotransmitters being released and the brain areas in which they are released, the regions that are activated in a brain scan may actually be inhibited rather than excited. Hence, from a functional perspective, these areas may be lit down rather than lit up. So basically, go on.
I'm guilty of using that term just right before, and I was talking about it.
Right. Well, we all were, but I mean, so what it's so if it's partially based on oxygen too, think about this. If I mentioned the monk whose brain scans were going crazy when he was meditating, but one of the things you do in meditation is breathing exercises, which provide more oxygen into your system, which then provide more oxygen into your brain, which might be what was setting off his brain scans.
Right.
Yeah.
But again, this is one of the materialistic arguments that they say, well, you do this and then this happens and it's just a machine. But it turns out that we don't actually know how to read that machine.
Yeah, it's still a black box.
Yeah. I mean, we know it does things when you do things, but we don't know what those things exactly are. I mean, I know I've heard things like, oh, if you do this thing to the brain, the person will see the color yellow. And I'm like, okay. And then I think, but let's use the analogy of a car. If you open up the hood and there's someone sitting in the driver's seat, and you open up the hood and you pull on the cable that controls the throttle, well, the car is going to rev up even if the person didn't push the gas. But that doesn't mean there's not somebody sitting in the car.
That's a good analogy.
So I think that's an important one. A lot of these terms, the way they're breaking them down, and there are notes for all of what they're saying. There's sightings and everything. It's a professional paper. This is not like some popular science article somewhere.
Yeah, this is not Gizmondo.
Yeah, exactly. Again, this comes from the Frontiers in Psychology website. And I will put a link for this article in the show notes so people can go read the whole thing if they want. It's quite long. Anything you guys want to say about the brain regions, or should we move on?
I think you said it.
Okay. So the next one is brainwashing. It says this term, which originated during the Korean War, but which is still invoked uncritically from time to time in academic literature, implies that powerful individuals wishing to persuade others can capitalize on a unique armamentarium. Thank you. Of coercive procedures to change their long-term attitudes. Nonetheless, the attitude change techniques used by so-called brainwashers are no different than standard persuasive methods identified by social psychologists, such as encouraging commitments to goals, manufacturing source credibility, forging an illusion of group consensus, and vivid testimonials. Furthermore, there are ample reasons to doubt whether brainwashing permanently alters beliefs. For example, during the Korean War, only a small minority of the 3,500 American political prisoners subjected to intense indoctrination techniques by Chinese captors generated false confessions. Moreover, an even smaller number, probably under 1%, displayed any sign of adherence to communist ideologies following their return to the U.S., and even these were individuals who returned to communist subcultures.
That's really interesting. It sounds like it's saying we're all brainwashers and all brainwashed.
In a way.
And you have to remain under the influence of brainwashing for it to, where it'll go.
and I feel that's kind of true. Like I think it's so that there's a thing people always say that people don't change. And for the most part, I feel that's true a lot of the time. People might want to change. But most people are not going to change. And the thing that will cause someone to change are very extreme circumstances. A shamanic awakening, a near-death experience, something spiritual is usually what kicks in that causes genuine change in people. So
Yeah, but
brainwashing.
at the same time, there
Go
are
on.
other forms of indoctrination, Soraya. I mean, there are only here in this point. This article is only talking about the Korean War,
Sure.
because why? Because of the famous Manchurian Candidate novel. But what about MK Ultra? And what about the indoctrination that is suffered by people who enter a religious cult? What about the indoctrination of people who go into Scientology? And that they swear by the benefits of Scientology, no matter what other people are showing, the evidence to the contrary. No, they are truly convinced, and they will remain indoctrinated until probably there's some kind of crisis or point that is reached in which the spell, to use for lack of a better word, is broken.
Well, you figure people who are getting involved in cults are often looking for something to believe in. And that includes people who get involved with Scientology. But for smaller cults, they're also usually surrounded by that. Like they join the cult, they don't leave the cult, they don't leave the group that is continually, encouraging this belief as something real.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's hard to get them away from that, but usually, getting them away from that and having them do a little bit of therapy, and they can usually break those beliefs, and then they wonder what the hell they were thinking.
And then they pick up some other belief.
Right, because they need something. They have to cling to something.
This goes back to my spiritual awakening with Goat taking his face off and saying they are all liars, and me coming to the Buddhist concept of transcendence, which is transcendence of all opinion. So the kind of this world of illusion is called Maya. I'm going to go way out on a limb and say all belief, in my opinion, is brainwashing. You go listen to CNN, turn CNN on and make that a habit. Pretty soon you're going to pick up their agenda.
Oh, sure.
It's going to church. I came out of Pentecostalism. It took me a while to come out of that and see a bigger picture and realize, wow, that was something like I was really stuck down in and really could not. This is what I said one time on a show talking about belief, that beliefs are restrictive. So if you have a belief, you're restricted to it, and it polarized against all other beliefs. You got to stick with one.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to me, this number 5, brainwashing, is saying, well, the term isn't really good because everybody does that.
Yeah. Well, and that's true. I mean, who we are, what we believe is based on our experiences, and to some degree genetics. I mean, we're predisposed, I would think, to certain things. Despite what we said about genes earlier, I don't mean there's a specific gene for things, but I think just who we are as a whole, as a physical being, it probably predisposes us to certain things. But everyone has a completely different life experience. No matter how similar you are to somebody, or how similar of an upbringing, you've all been affected by different things. You've all had different views of those things, and those things have had different effects on you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes up your view of the world. So no one's view of the world is necessarily right or wrong. It's just different based on those things.
I would say the biggest indoctrination around is believing that you are an independent person with free will. This is going back to my Buddhist thing, that all of us are connected. Nobody's really an individual, on there. We're so connected in so many different ways, and it's all these beliefs that are separating us, keeping us separate, putting up the wall.
But I think the separation is for us to grow.
Yep.
Without separation, we would be stagnant. You know, it's
Yeah.
it's that separation, that conflict that creates new things.
Diversity.
Yeah. And whereas I fall in line with a lot of Buddhist beliefs, I lean away from the idea that what our goal is unity. I think the goal is creation of new things. I think that our individual selves actually do matter and do. It's almost like we were created to expand the universe.
Yeah, I guess I should sort of elaborate a little bit. David Lynch has a really simplistic way of talking about this. Using the vehicle of meditation to touch that transcendent place of oneness just briefly, and then coming back up to this, it changes everything here. So it's not like, I mean, it's not someplace you live, but you can visit and come back here, and it changes everything and makes you realize that there is that transcendence. And so it's not like, oh, I'm one with everything now. But I don't know if I'm making any, it's really hard.
But you can feel that sense of something greater that you're connected to.
And so it's not just your opinion, and that's the ultimate truth anymore. You've touched something way bigger than anybody's opinion, including your own.
Fair enough. Okay, let's see. The next one's a short one, but I think worth mentioning, which is bystander apathy. Says the classic work of Darley and Lathan and Rodin underscored the counterintuitive point that when it comes to emergencies, there is rarely safety in numbers. As this and subsequent research demonstrated, the more people present at an emergency, the lower the likelihood of receiving help. In early research, this phenomenon was called bystander apathy, a term that endures in many academic articles. Nevertheless, research demonstrates that most bystanders are far from apathetic in emergencies. To the contrary, they are typically quite concerned about the victim, but are psychologically frozen by well-established psychological processes such as pluralistic ignorance, diffusion of responsibility, and sheer fears of appearing foolish.
Pluralistic ignorance. That's interesting. Yeah, have you guys seen the videos where they'll send, they get like a guy with a camera and they'll send people in these situations where obviously somebody should help, and people just stand around and look.
Yeah, it's like they don't know what to do.
Like 1 in 10 may, stand up. I think it really points to leadership skills. Leadership is somebody who's courageous and also empathetic. And, like I said, 1 in 10 people in those videos like that will come to the aid.
And Red Pill, you saw people kind of come to the aid firsthand with this last earthquake.
Yeah, that's true. People show the best aspects of themselves, risking life and limb in order to help complete strangers. I try to also do a bit of help, go to places where they were collecting food and supplies that were going to be sent to the survivors of the catastrophe. And there were many youngsters who were, very eager to be signed up in order to hand out these supplies to faraway places, it was really inspiring to see that kind of selflessness, especially among the youngsters, the millennial generation, those that we tend to criticize and think that, they have their nose buried in their phones and they don't care about the politics or about, what's going on around them. Turns out that's not the case. That turns out that maybe, the reason why they are most of the time so immersed in social media is probably, maybe it's a sign of despair. They know that we are leaving them a really messed up world, that has such problems as global warming and increased inequality and war and terrorism and violence and all of that. Not to mention that all the things that their previous generations used to enjoy, like a steady job and social security and the chance to retire once you reach a certain age, they're not going to be able to enjoy that. Forget about it. So under those circumstances, I myself will be trying to be numb through playing games on my iPad or whatever, and then when the situation rose, these youngsters, they show the older generations, that they care, and that they're willing to make a difference. So I don't know. Apathy. It's a difficult thing to. I think it's a difficult thing to rate. I wonder if those people are rating it based on the reaction of citizens of a big urban center, in contrast with people who may be living in a small rural environment, a town of less than 500 individuals, in which case probably that apathy is non-existent because everybody knows everybody and they are all neighbors and they all care for each other.
I'm sure that helps. But even what you just said about the earthquake, though, you figure what these people are doing is they want to help, but they're looking for leadership in what they need to do to help.
Mhm.
Exactly.
So I think Aaron has that down right, that it's a leadership thing. People just don't they can't take that self-initiative because they're either uncertain or or they just don't know. Like, should I do something? And if so, what should I do? Someone needs to come by and tell me,
Mhm. Well, going back to my hippy dippy oneness stuff, a earthquake is like pretty hard to ignore and stay in your apathetic state.
True.
I think if you're talking about small community and how connected they are, and like in most of us, you've heard that we're more connected all over the world, but more isolated at the same time, kind of in our little things. And I think that isolation, when the walls kind of are literally falling down, that goes away and we become one again and really care for each other. The psychological processes it's talking about that cause the frozenness where people don't act. I think the most interesting one is fears of appearing foolish.
Yeah.
Mm.
I can relate to that. Like, all growing up, I did not step out much at all because exactly for that reason. Pluralistic ignorance, I'm still scratching my head over. Does that mean, I'm thinking like pluralism, like relativism or something, but is it saying like many ignorances?
Probably. In social psychology, pluralistic ignorance is a situation in which a majority of group members privately reject a norm but incorrectly assume that most others accept it and therefore go along with it. This is also described as no one believes but everyone thinks that everyone believes.
And diffusion of responsibility. I'm going to have to claim that one too. I do that a lot.
Okay. Tim, anything?
I think you guys pretty much covered it.
Okay. All right. The next one relates back to the whole depression thing, which is chemical imbalance. Thanks in part to the success of direct-to-consumer marketing campaigns by drug companies, the notion that major depression and allied disorders are caused by a chemical imbalance of neurotransmitters, such as serotonin and
Norepinephrine.
Thank you, has become a virtual truism in the eyes of the public. This phrase even crops up in some academic sources. For example, one author wrote that one overreaching framework for conceptualizing mental illness is a biological model that posits a chemical imbalance. Nevertheless, the evidence for the chemical imbalance model is at best slim. One prominent psychiatrist even dubbed it an urban legend. There is no known optimal level of neurotransmitters in the brain, so it is unclear what would constitute an imbalance. Nor is there any evidence for an optimal ratio among different neurotransmitter levels. Moreover, although serotonin reuptake inhibitors such as fluoxetine, which is Prozac, and Zoloft, appear to alleviate the symptoms of severe depression, there is evidence that at least one serotonin reuptake enhancer, which is Stablon, is also useful for depression. The fact that two different classes of medications exert opposing effects on serotonin's levels raises questions concerning a simplistic chemical imbalance model.
I love these names for these drugs. Stablon.
Oh, it's actually tianapine.
Yeah, that's the number one argument you hear when I've had conversations about, well, I'm not really in support of pharmaceuticals, and I don't know if you think I'm depressed. I don't think I'd be taking farms for it. And they're like, well, I'm clinically depressed, and so I have a chemical imbalance, and so this is what I need.
Yep, right. I've heard it from numerous people. These are people on these medications will tell you, I have a chemical imbalance.
Yep.
And presumably that's what they were told. I mean, they're not coming up with this, on their own.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, because it presupposes there is a normal, chemical balance in the brain, and that, it's a kind of worm. What constitutes a quote unquote normal brain in contrast with an abnormal brain. And it's kind of racist if you think about it.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if racist is the right word, but I think I got your gist
Prejudice.
of that. Yeah.
It reminds me of Frankenstein and him getting an abnormal brain. He didn't really have an abnormal brain. He had he was like a child. He had the mind of a child.
Yeah. But I mean that's obviously connected to what we were talking about earlier, and it's interesting that both increasing and decreasing serotonin levels can stop depression.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which suggests maybe that just needs to be a change, and it doesn't matter which way it goes.
Could be. Yeah, it also suggests we don't understand serotonin levels very well.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's probably more likely the case.
Again, does stopping depression enhance your life, or does it just allow you to more comfortably sit in front of Netflix?
Yes, well, these are the ultimate questions. The next one is family genetic studies. This is interesting. The phrase family genetic studies is commonly used in psychiatry to refer to designs in which investigators examine the familial aggregation of one or more disorders, such as panic disorder or major depression, within intact, i.e., non-adoptive families. Given that the familial aggregation of one or more disorders within intact families could be due to shared environment rather than or in addition to shared genes, the phrase family genetic study is misleading. This term implies erroneously that familial clustering of a disorder is necessarily more likely to be genetic than environmental. It may also imply incorrectly that studies of intact families permit investigators to disentangle the effects of shared genes from shared environment. Twin or adoption studies are necessary to accomplish that goal.
So we're talking like psychological disorders like panic, depression.
Right, and they're saying that it's genetically based, but they're arguing that sure, it may have an effect, but how much of it is environment that's causing it?
Weirdly enough, the thing that pops up in my head is people in the occult that go on and on and on about witch blood.
Yeah.
Which, is, I'm from this. I think it's poo-poo, and I think this is in support of it being poo-poo.
Okay.
Is that like what the people who talk about being ancestral witches? Is that?
Yeah.
I've run into that a good bit, and their words are, first of all, it's the same thing as the doing the DNA test. You know,
Yeah.
it may or may not be true. But second of all, I've noticed that certain people will be in all of that. Like, oh, she's an ancestral witch. I was like, okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. I've known people who have claimed to be in the Merovingian bloodline, the bloodline of Christ.
Yep.
They weren't very Christly people.
The next one is pretty simple, genetically determined. It's kind of saying some of the stuff they've already said. Few, if any, psychological capacities are genetically determined at most. They are genetically influenced. Even schizophrenia, which is among the most heritable of all mental disorders, appears to have a heritability of between 70 and 90% as estimated by twin designs, leaving room for still undetermined environmental influences. Moreover, data strongly suggests that schizophrenia and most other major mental disorders are highly polygenic. In addition, the heritability of most adult personality traits, such as neuroticism and extroversion, appear to be between 30 and 60%. This finding again points to the potent role for environmental influences. So again, going with the idea that, yes, genetics may play a bit of a role in things, but likely it's environment having more of an effect than just genetics.
And even, going with the heretic idea that there may be other influences at work, like spirit possession.
Yeah, sure. Gold standard. In the domains of psychological and psychiatric assessment, there are precious few, if any, genuine gold standards. Essentially all measures, even those with high levels of validity for their intended purposes, are necessarily fallible indicators of their respective constructs. As a consequence, the widespread practice referring to even well-validated measures of personality or psychopathy as gold standards for the respective construct is misleading. If authors intend to refer to measures as extensively validated, they should simply do so. And of course, that's an easily thrown around term. Hardwired. The term hardwired has become enormously popular in press accounts and academic writings in reference to human psychological capacities that are presumed by some scholars to be partially innate, such as religion, cognitive biases, prejudice, or aggression. For example, one author team reported that males are more sensitive than females to negative news stories and conjectured that males may be hardwired for negative news. Nonetheless, growing data on neuroplasticity suggests that, with the possible exception of inborn reflexes, remarkably few psychological capacities in humans are genuinely hardwired, that is, inflexible in their behavioral expression. Moreover, virtually all psychological capacities, including emotions and language, are modifiable by environmental experiences.
I think that's really fascinating because, did you guys grow up hearing, well, males are more logical and females are more emotive, and that's just biological. But the older I get, the less I believe that. I think that's more a consequence of our society. 40, 50 years ago, the man went to work, came home, acted like an ass, and dealt with it and dealt with the kids. So the guy never dealt with his emotions.
Right.
And, I think I have a hard time dealing with my emotions, but I think that's purely just because that's how it's not biological. That's just behavioral, learned behavior.
And also education, the idea that if you run into some trouble and you were showing your emotions, you were scolded by it. That men don't cry, cover your tears, suck it up.
Man up.
Man up, exactly,
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to that. Plus, logical, okay? How many guys have you met that respond purely to ego? not logic. But ego seems more logical than emotion.
Yeah.
And that's simply not the case. It's just ego, you know?
Yeah, I think of Sherlock Holmes and, people, he's the ultimate ratiocinator, the ultimate logician, but he's the creation of an idealist. There's no person like that, no Spocks. And even especially in the atheistic circles and Calvinistic circles that I monitored as entertainment, those guys love to think of themselves as purely logical. And if you notice when they get into these debates, they are highly emotional. It's emotion fueling it, not logic.
And ego. They have to be right.
Definitely, yeah.
The hardcore skeptic falls into that too.
Yes, absolutely. The next one, very relevant to things we talk about, hypnotic trance.
Ooh.
The notion that hypnosis is characterized by a distinct trance state remains one of the enduring myths of popular psychology. In a sample of 276 undergraduates, found that participants gave high ratings between 5 and 5.5 on a 1 to 7 scale in 2 experimental conditions to the item, hypnosis is an altered state of consciousness, quite different from normal waking consciousness. Perhaps not surprisingly, the phrase hypnotic trance continues to appear in numerous articles written for the general public as well as in academic sources. Nevertheless, the evidence that hypnosis is a distinct trance state that differs quantitatively from waking consciousness is scant. There is no consistent evidence for distinctive psychological, e.g., functional brain imaging, markers of hypnosis, nor is there persuasive or even especially suggestive evidence that hypnosis is associated with unique behavioral features. For example, suggested responses, including hallucinations, amnesia, and pain reduction, can be achieved in the absence of hypnotic induction, and even when participants report being awake and alert.
I think we're going back to the brainwashing thing. Again, being in Pentecostal charismatic circles, everybody was worked up to, this is my experience, I'm not saying all Pentecostals are like this, worked up to a very suggestible state, and people claimed healings from this, healings from that. There was a MU episode, I think, with the lady, what is it, The Power of 8? Have you guys heard of that?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the same stuff that was going on in Pentecostal circles is going on there. But the difference is the lady that was speaking, seemed to have scientific data to back up her stuff. I don't know. It was like stuff like pain reduction. I don't know. But this is saying there's no distinct state, no distinct hypnotic state. And did I catch that right? Yeah,
that there's not a state that is technically a hypnotic trance. It's not like you're getting to a point and now you're in a hypnotic trance. It is. It can be a variation of slightly altered states of consciousness.
So I know you guys have heard of like the different brainwave, like theta, whatever, delta.
Right.
Yeah. I know.
Has any of you been hypnotized?
No.
Sort of. I with YouTube videos, I started going to him first for sleep, and she counted me down, put me in a really relaxed place, and then I was out like a light. And the next thing I knew, I was waking up, and it was when she was counting me back up in this YouTube video. So I came back out of it at her command unconsciously from sleep. So that was interesting. So I went on to do these past life regression YouTube videos just for fun, just to see what would happen. And I actually had a vision or whatever of being in Canada, at this base of these mountains. And I was asked to look down at my shoes. I saw what shoes I was wearing. I had a wife and family. I mean, this could all be just, imagination, but it was an interesting experience.
I had a medium up at the radio show when we were doing Where Did the Road Go? And this was a couple of years ago. She came up with the Ghost Hunters of the Finger Lakes. And she did a past life regression on one of my Last Exit co-hosts who volunteered. And she brought him back through potential past lives, or there was no way we could verify any of it, so it doesn't really mean too much. But what freaked him out is he had no idea, he didn't remember any of it. I showed him the video and it literally creeped him out.
I definitely think there's, in the occult, Golden Dawn looked very down. It was a big no hypnosis. And still, I know you, Seriah, kind of have a lot of ufologists kind of have this, let's not go there. That can muddy the waters a lot and bring up false memories, and has brought up false memories and the satanic panic and all that.
Yep.
But I also think of the work of Milton Erickson, one of the most well-known hypnotist guys. And I don't think there's any question that it can help people stop smoking.
Yes.
Weight issues and stuff like that. So it's doing something for people. I think it's a dangerous tool if in the wrong hands. But
the argument is hypnosis is a great behavioral modification tool. It is not a good memory recollection tool. It is not a memory enhancer.
Very well put. Yeah.
And if you're going to use, so if you're going to say, all right, let's hypnotize this person and see if they can remember the license plate they saw, and you know what the license plate is, and you hypnotize them and they give you the license plate and it's right, well, yes, now you know it enhanced that particular memory. But when you're dealing with alien abduction stuff, there's no way to verify any of it. The only evidence you have is what's coming out of that hypnotic state, which is not reliable.
I heard your interview with Travis Walton and the lady who did the documentary with him.
Yes, Jennifer Steen.
Yeah, and him talking about how much hypnosis helped him with the
fear.
Yeah, and just being able to talk about the experience without experiencing that fear.
Yeah. I thought that was interesting. Okay, let's see. Next one is influence of gender or social class, education, ethnicity, depression, extroversion, intelligence, etc. on X. Influence and cognitive terms such as effect are inherently causal in nature. Hence, they should be used extremely judiciously in reference to individual differences such as personality traits or group differences, which cannot be experimentally manipulated. This is not to say that individual or group differences cannot exert a causal influence on behavior, only that research designs that examine these differences are virtually always, with the rare exception of experiments of nature in which individual differences are altered by unusual events, correlation or quasi-experimental. Hence, researchers should be explicit that when using such phrases as the influence of gender, that they are almost always proposing a hypothesis from the data, not drawing a logical justified conclusion from them. This inferential limitation notwithstanding, the phrase the influence of gender alone appears in over 45,000 manuscripts in the Google Scholar database. So it's kind of what we were saying earlier a little bit, that this stuff, there's one thing to have the data, but their hypothesis is it's because of gender or because of this or because of that, but the data doesn't actually support those things.
And that's all because it's very skewed data. I mean, in most psychology experiments, it's kind of like a cliche to say that the favorite lab rat of psychologists is psychology undergraduates, So what they're using is college kids, usually, the middle class white kids, they use that for their experiments instead of trying to use a more varied population. So obviously you have to question the results, in regards to these notions of gender or other ideas they try to compare.
I've experienced something similar to that. When I was in college, I kept trying to get into philosophy classes, and they would always fill up. So I ended up taking psychology classes. I took so many of them that they said the next class you take, you will be in the clinic. You know that will be the class. I took quite a few psychology classes. I did not take the one that got me into the clinic, but
You don't mean as a patient in a clinic?
no. But at some point, I remember the professor asking, and this was in the last class I took, like, who here has gone to therapy or seen a psychologist? And everyone in the class raised their hand except me.
Huh.
And it was stunning. It was just like stunning moment where like, I just felt alone in this sea of of hands.
Abnormal.
I realized there's an element of self-perpetuation, I think, to all of this. People who have gone to therapists their whole life become therapists.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
It's interesting who you marry.
Me?
Yeah.
She's not a therapist. She's just good with she can just surgically dissect people mentally.
And what this stands out to me again is that, our culture keeps wanting to, especially with gender, kind of create these rules of this is, female, this is male.
Yeah.
And it's not there. It's not real. And I think part of the whole transgender thing, I think it would be a different scenario if those cultural limitations were not there. And I say this partially because I've talked to a few people who have been transgender, and I listened to Project Archivist when they had someone on talking about it who had gone through changing genders. And everything they've said sounds to me like, it's not that they necessarily start out wanting to change genders so much as the way they want to behave, the way they want to dress, the way they want to be is not acceptable. Our culture puts those walls up and says, you have to be this. But they don't want to be that. They kind of want to just be themselves, and they're not allowed to. And eventually they end up having to, now that they have a fairly easy option compared to years ago to change gender, and it's more accessible, it's more acceptable, that becomes the solution. But the problem is our culture, I think, more than anything else. I mean, there are some people who want to have their legs cut off. I mean, there's always going to be somebody, not to compare transgender people to people who want to be amputated, but what I'm saying is there's always going to be people who don't feel their bodies are right.
Mm-hmm.
But and that was a horrible comparison, and I'm sorry, but there are people who want to have limbs amputated because they feel that those limbs don't belong on their body. If they finally get someone to amputate them, they feel more themselves, as weird as that is. But if you have someone who literally wants to be, who's male and literally wants to be female, we have that option. But I wonder how many people would have that surgery if our cultural lines were different.
Somebody going to say something?
I just wanted to not interject, but also add to something that Christopher Ryan has said with regards to testosterone. Nowadays, in our culture, especially with some of the things that is unfolding right now, with regards to accusations of sexual harassment in Hollywood and elsewhere, there's this idea that testosterone is some kind of like toxin. There's something that people need to be on the lookout on, or almost like to be scared of. But Chris Ryan has said something very interesting with how young male in our society, obviously, when you reach a certain age and your body is full of testosterone, there's obviously one thing in your mind
Sure.
you have, which is, try to have a sexual intercourse, which is something that obviously in our society is almost impossible to have for young teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
And there's almost this idea of, being punished by having those desires and trying to satisfy those desires. And he has mentioned this in plenty of his podcasts of tangentially speaking, how that level of rejection may cause the scars in some people that eventually unfold into this hatred toward women, and these tendencies to hate women, or maybe the tendencies to try to get even with women, and maybe that would be conducive to sexual aggression, sexual abuse, whatever.
Entitlement.
Exactly, but then you will say, well, hence, that's because of testosterone. Well, no, maybe that's because of the way that these young males are repressed in our society. So it's not really the case of gender. It's environmental. It's the way that society treats these I don't want to say symptoms, but these cases, right? And how these repressions and these rejections and these hatred, then they fester, to put it in those terms, into really, really nasty outcomes.
Yes, yeah, and our culture likes to make everything binary. You're either this or you're that. So you're either male or you're female. And rather than saying, there is a variation from one extreme all the way to the other extreme, with people falling everywhere in between,
and that's okay.
Exactly, and that's what makes life what it is. That's what it should be. That's the variation is important. The same with race. It's not like this person's black and this person's white. No, there is every variation from very, very dark to very, very white, and everything in between. There's no cutoff. There's no wall. They're not these separations. These separations are creations of culture.
Yeah, I always thought of myself. I remember my mom telling me from when I was really little that the doctor told her I was going to be female. And I don't know if that influenced me or not, but I've always felt a bit more feminine than all my male friends in the things that I like. I always like to be around females more, just not into sports and all that as much. Not to say I don't have, that there are biological differences between male and female. I think, what is it? A fetus starts out female, and then it becoming male is something that happens as it develops.
Yeah, I think so.
But we can't deny that those testosterone gives the human different drives than somebody without testosterone.
Sure.
But I kind of look at this from an esoteric perception of, rather than using the terms male, female, I like yin or yang, and being steeped in Hermeticism, this idea of the holy hermaphrodite, where both are acknowledged, and they're what you're trying to do is balance them.
Yes.
So, I see these as almost like energies, rather than something that a person is.
I think that's accurate.
Yeah.
I'll stop there before I stumble around.
Interestingly enough, Aaron, my mother also said that she was told I was to be a girl. They even had a name picked out for me, and then I was a boy.
So you're saying you disappointed them?
Yeah, I don't know.
Henceforth.
I was number 6 of 6, so I think they were pretty numb.
Ah.
I was liken it to getting hit by a brick. Each kid, by the time that 6th brick comes along, you're pretty numb.
I'll have to ask my mom if they had a name picked out for me. I also think of Jungian stuff with the animus and anima, and
Yes.
so every female has an animus within them, and that's their idealized whatever. And so I think,
Idealized male self.
yeah, I don't know how this meshes with like stuff going on today, but I believe I've definitely experienced my anima in dreams and visions.
Oh,
and
yeah.
that problem I have with expressing myself emotively, since I started this magical work, this woman is more and more present in dreams and stuff. And I believe, since reading a little bit of Jung, this is what this is. And sort of me having to confront this and, like I said, try and balance those energies. So I think anybody that's off one way or the other needs to take a look at the other side and try shoot for balance.
All right. So the next one I think a lot of us already know, but I'm going to go over it anyway, which is the lie detector test. Surely one of the most pernicious misnomers in psychology, the term a lie detector test is often used synonymously with the storied polygraph test. This test is misnamed. It's an arousal detector, not a lie detector. Because it measures nonspecific psychophysiological arousal rather than the fear of detection per se, it is associated with high false positive rates, meaning that it frequently misidentifies honest individuals as dishonest. In addition, a polygraph test is susceptible to false negatives stemming from the use of physical, biting the tongue, for example, and mental, like performing complex mental arithmetic countermeasures. This evidence notwithstanding, the mythical allure of the polygraph test persists. In one survey, 45% of undergraduates agreed that this test was an accurate detector of falsehoods. And I think a lot of people know that. It's, you know, if you go into a lie detector and you are nervous, you're probably going to fail.
I would
Yeah,
definitely.
and yet, you know, they keep saying that Travis Walton's case is the best one because he has passed who knows how many lie detector tests. And I have
Right.
nothing against Travis Walton, you know. Personally, I think that he experienced something real.
Oh, yeah.
But the lie detector tests don't really prove anything beyond the idea that perhaps he believes that what he went through is true, or what he says happened to him is true, but
Right.
not that what he says happened to him actually happened.
Well, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, lie detectors are not admissible in court for the very reason that they are so wrought with problems.
I think it depends on the court and the state.
Really? Okay. I mean,
yeah,
I know hypnosis is not admissible in court because of its unreliability. But I thought lie detectors weren't either.
I think in most cases they are not. But I seem to remember reading very recently that, and I don't know if it's submitted as sort of in the same way a character witness is submitted. You know what I mean?
I see.
As hard.
That could be.
Yeah, not as hard evidence, but as, you know, adjunct sort of evidence. Right. But I seem to remember very recently reading, and I was surprised because I thought as well, like, I didn't think they still use those.
Okay, the next one is the love molecule. Over 6,000 websites have dubbed the hormone oxytocin?
Oxytocin.
Okay, the love molecule. Others have named it the trust molecule, the cuddle hormone, or moral molecule. Nonetheless, data derived from controlled studies imply that all of these appellations are woefully simplistic. Most evidence suggests that oxytocin renders individuals more sensitive to social information, both positive and negative. For example, although intranasal oxytocin seems to increase within group trust, it may also increase out-group mistrust. In addition, among individuals with high levels of trait aggressiveness, oxytocin boosts propensities towards intimate partner violence following provocation. Comparable phrases applied to other neural messengers, such as the term pleasure molecule as a monkey for dopamine, are equally misleading. And again, this comes down to, you know, trying to simplify something that's very complex and, you know, toss it out to the society at large as, oh, we understand this now. Love's just a molecule.
Right.
So,
So it sounds like a more accurate term would be the love/hate molecule.
but again, it's based on so many other factors. It's not the thing itself. It's just something that is affected or helps to affect different connections. Number 17, multiple personality disorder, and this is a big one, I think.
Juicy.
Although the term multiple personality disorder was expunged from the American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic manual over 2 decades ago and has since been replaced by dissociative identity disorder, it persists in many academic sources. Nevertheless, even ardent proponents of the view that DID is a naturally occurring condition that stems largely from childhood trauma acknowledge that multiple personality disorder is a misnomer because individuals with DID do not genuinely harbor 2 or more fully developed personalities. Moreover, laboratory studies of the memories of individuals with DID demonstrate that the alter personalities or personality states of individuals with DID are not insulated by impenetrable amnesiac barriers.
I wish Kelly was here to talk about this one. She actually dated a guy, or her ex. I don't know the full story, but they would actually go into a toy store with Kelly's daughter, and he would go into this other personality, and she would look back, and he would be in the middle of the floor opening a toy, playing with it. And she said also sexually, he was in one personality, he was completely different. And when he was in another personality, that personality would get angry with her because it felt that she cheated on him with the
Other personality.
right.
Oh God.
So I have an ex who had, among other things, dissociative disorder. And this stemmed from trauma when she was a child. And it wasn't there when I met her. It started, for some reason, and I did a lot of research on this since I was dealing with it firsthand, or secondhand, I guess, since it wasn't me having the experience. But around the age of 28 or so is when this stuff usually happens, like when this buried trauma comes up. And she, although I totally can agree that they weren't fully formed personalities, she had 7 different personalities that would jump in if she got under too much stress. And she could not easily remember what they did. And
Now, please go on.
And I've heard a few people say, well, that does, this stuff doesn't happen until it's suggested by a therapist, but she hadn't seen a therapist. She didn't actually know what was happening to her. It happened very spontaneously.
Okay, but at the same time, I have heard cases of people who suffered from multiple personality disorder, in which one of the personalities needed eyeglasses in order to see.
Yes.
And the other personality didn't. There was actually a physiological change between one personality and the other. So how do you explain that?
I explain it by saying that we control more of our reality and our person than we realize and are able to do on a conscious level. So the personality that needs glasses, well, that's their overall self trying to tell them something. Maybe they're too nearsighted in life in general, whereas the other personality isn't, so it doesn't need glasses.
I'm going to go the woo-woo route here and say that my opinion is that it's different spirits.
I can accept that.
I've experienced this a little, but in certain circumstances. And people that have witnessed it definitely think it's something spiritual. Who knows? It was more than anything chemical. This is back when I was drinking pretty badly, and there would be 3 or 4 different personalities that would pop up. One talked with a British accent, and I can't do it like if I'm not in that place. I have a crappy British accent, but this one would pop up occasionally. So the people that were witnessing this said I was like totally different. I mean, this is expected with alcohol. I guess. I don't know.
Sure.
They felt it was my behavior was so different that they thought it was spiritual. Since then, I kind of looked over some stuff with people doing out of body stuff. It's kind of complicated, but the auric egg, people have experienced ancestors that are kind of there within your auric egg. So I don't know. This is kind of a weird hypothesis, but I think they're going to just be walk-ins in certain psychological states. Boop, you go out and somebody else in your immediate vicinity walks in.
I also know somebody who, and she doesn't do it intentionally, but if she gets under too much stress, it's almost like she psychologically boxes stuff off, and she no longer remembers it, and she doesn't know she does it, so it's just gone, and it's like, and having had the experience of someone with dissociative disorder, I'm almost like it's similar to dissociative disorder, except there's no other personalities. It's all her. It's just her memories change. And it's only stressful, like really stressful things. It's like she'll get upset. There'll be some, and then suddenly everything's fine, and she has no idea what you're asking her about.
I can almost willfully do that to the extent where often something will come to me, and I'll know, like, I'm never going to need this again. I don't need this information, so I just let it go. But sometimes it gets me in trouble too, because sometimes I'll be like, well, Allison's got this covered, so I don't need this. And then I'll let it go. And then, I'll find out, like, no, I didn't need that.
Well, I can tell you that as someone who is fluent or tries to be fluent in 2 different languages, which is English, the one that I'm using right now, and Spanish, which is my mother's tongue, I know that I have different personalities when I'm using each one. You know what I mean? And
That's really interesting.
Some people have also talked about this. For example, Chris Ryan again. He's married to a woman who is from Mozambique, so she speaks different languages. She speaks Portuguese, and she speaks Spanish, and she speaks French, and she speaks. And he says that he notices, like, there's kind of like a different person whenever she uses a different languages. And I feel that is totally true. And I don't think it's necessarily that paranormal. I think that's the use of different neural pathways in your brain in order to try to communicate using a different method, and that may elicit a different change in your personality.
How would you say you are different when speaking English?
Oh, I'm more friendly. I'm a totally a-hole when I'm speaking Spanish.
Well, could that be also because you don't have to think about it as much when you
That's
speak
true. Yeah, when I'm speaking in English, I actually have to think what I want to say instead of like spitting it out from my gut, like if I were speaking something that is innate in me. So that definitely has a certain level of restraint toward my reactions to if someone is actually bothering me, and if I want to respond in a very scornful or emotive matter, the fact that I have to really think about the way that I want to respond in a way calms me down, so the outcome will not be as as emotive or as fiery or as scolding as it would be if I was speaking in Spanish.
That's interesting. to some extent, I think we all have different personalities that we present in different situations. It's on air as opposed to with our loved ones or with strangers or in different settings at work. I go back to the Buddhist thing with meditation, this no self thing. In these deep meditative states, there's no thing that can be identified as you. So the ego kind of goes and you become everything. And so at that deep level of meditation, there's nothing you can point to that says this is me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think again, you're made up of your experiences and your memories, and what does that say when someone doesn't have those memories, whether it be amnesia, whether it be because they're boxing them off, or in other personalities, you know, it affects the whole in ways that we don't fully understand. That's what I loved about the show Dark Matter, which of course they canceled on Sci-Fi, but that you had these people who were like the biggest villains in the galaxy, and they get their minds wiped. So their memories are gone. They remember how to do things, and they have some basic memories and stuff, but they don't have a memory of who they were, and they become completely different people because they didn't have all those horrible experiences that made them the villains of the galaxy to begin with.
It makes me think of Jungian stuff again, where it's acknowledged that you have these like shadow, anima or animus, this idea of this soul, and the whole idea is to integrate all of those into a wholeness. So yeah, it's really interesting now that I'm kind of thinking about it.
All right, so let's do a few more of these.
Who are we?
Yeah, who are we is a great question. Neural signature. Again, this kind of has to do with brain scans and stuff. One group of authors, after observing that compliance with social norms was associated with activations in certain brain regions, lateral orbitofrontal cortex and right dorsolateral cortex, referred to the neural signature of social norm compliance. Others have referred to neural signatures or brain signatures of psychiatric disorders such as anorexia nervosa and autism spectrum disorder. Nevertheless, identifying a genuine neural signature would necessitate the discovery of a specific pattern of brain responses that possesses nearly perfect sensitivity and specificity for a given condition or other phenotype. At the present time, neuroscientists are not remotely close to pinpointing such a signature for any psychological disorder or trait. Again, how little we know about the brain. I'll read this one. It's pretty simple. No difference between groups. Many researchers, after reporting a group difference that does not attain conventional levels of statistical significance, will go on to state that there was no difference between groups. Similarly, many authors will report that a non-significant correlation between two variables means that there was no association between the variables. But a failure to reject the null hypothesis does not mean that the null hypothesis, strictly speaking, has been confirmed. And that's the basic gist of that one. Pretty simple. There's a difference between saying that there's no difference and they weren't able to detect a difference.
Yeah, so statistics, right?
Yes, yeah. Authors are instead advised to write no significant difference between groups or no significant correlation between variables. And the next one is the objective personality test. We'll end on this one. This is number 20. Many authors refer to paper and pencil personality instruments that employ a standard true-false item response format, such as the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory 2, as objective tests, ostensibly to contrast them with more subjective measures, such as unstructured interviews or projective techniques, like the Rorschach ink blot test. Nevertheless, although the former measures can be scored objectively, that is, with little or no error, there's a whole bunch of extra stuff there, that they often require considerable subjective judgment on the part of the respondents. For example, an item such as "I have many headaches" can be interpreted in numerous ways arising from the ambiguity of the meanings of many and headache. So-called objective personality tests are also often subjective with respect to interpretation. For example, even different computerized MMPI-2 interpretive programs display only moderate levels of inter-rater agreement regarding proposed diagnoses. Not surprisingly, clinicians routinely disagree in their interpretations of profiles on the MMPI-2 and other objective tests. We therefore recommend that these measures be called structured tests, a term that refers only to their response format and carries no implication as that they are to be interpreted objectively by either examinee or examiner. And I think that makes a lot of sense when they're talking about, the ambiguity of many and headaches. Right off the bat, you don't think too much about that, but I have many headaches for one person is completely different for what that means to another person, and what they constitute as a headache is completely different.
Yeah, I think with language, you're going to have trouble finding real objectivity anywhere.
Yeah.
For personality.
Also the idea that personalities are like fixed, set in stone. You know what I mean? That you have a certain personality, and that's who you are forever and ever. And I feel that that's not the case. That people change. Organisms are in a constant state of flux. A dynamic between homeostasis and transistasis, and the different states, and which is completely normal in living beings. And I feel that would be also the case with psychological states. Sometimes you have a certain personality, and depending maybe on your circumstances or your environment, you will be rated with a different personality, if you were taking a test that day.
Yeah.
I think the most time-tested personality test is astrology, natal charts. Even there, I mean, every doctor used to have astrological knowledge, and there was corrective astrology. So if they wanted to correct something, they would fix a talisman up for you and give it to you, and that would correct it wasn't something that was fixed. It could be changed.
I think astrology meant a lot more when people lived with the seasons.
Mm-hmm.
So back when people felt the impact of the seasons, being born in winter was going to affect the rest of your life. Nowadays, I question how relevant it still is.
Well, I mean, Tim, I guessed James and your wife's sun sign, right?
Yeah.
Just from talking to him briefly, I didn't get right because I think you're a little bit more reserved and a little bit more mysterious.
Mm-hmm.
It's the beard.
Yes, my wife is a good beard.
So yeah, I think we'll stop there with the personality things. I'm going to post this to the notes of the show, so if people want to check it out, they can. Like I said, there's about 50 things on here. We will do another show and cover some more of them. And because some of them it's broken into inaccurate or misleading terms, frequently misused terms, ambiguous terms, oxymorons, pleonasms, and then there's just the concluding thoughts. But
yeah, we didn't get to number 27, the scientific method. That's
a good one.
Yeah, 28 also truth serum.
Yep. So we will do part 2 to this, and fetish, and we will go through some more of these, because these do, when you're dealing with the paranormal, when you're dealing with people, you're dealing with consciousness, you're dealing with how we interpret things, how we see things, how we respond to things. And so looking at these, I mean, I see everything we do is connected into these type of things.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to understand these and get the closest we can to a good understanding of these things while we're looking at the things we don't understand.
Yeah.
This all has called to mind to me, and I think this is a quote from Peter Carroll, the chaos magician fellow. In one of his books, I believe it was him, he made the statement that psychology is the only science in all the world where every book that was ever written on it could disappear overnight and nothing would change.
And it's also, I've heard that the more someone gets schooling in psychology, the less effective they are in actually helping people.
Yeah.
Ram Dass comes to mind.
Really? How so?
He came to the realization that he wasn't helping anybody because he was a therapist. So he quit his job and became Ram Dass. His name was Richard something, I forget. So yeah, it was an interesting story.
I did not know that. I mean, I'm familiar with some of Ram Dass's stuff, but I didn't know that he was once a psychologist, I guess.
I think he was a developmental psychologist.
Interesting. All right. Any last words?
Well, it goes to show that psychology is like every social science, it's in a constant state of flux. It has to be constantly revised, constantly updated, and that's a good thing, I wish ufology following those steps, I wish someone will write the list of things to avoid in ufology.
Yeah, let's write this up for ufology.
Same thing in the Bigfoot world. Yeah.
I think this is hopeful. I think we're coming away from the materialistic, well, you have a bad brain, so there's nothing we can do for you except here's some pills, to something much more nuanced and personal and individualized. So I think it's hopeful.
I do love the bad brains. I do. I mean, I do.
What was I going to say about it? Oh, it also shows you this is an academic paper we're taking this from. Versus, and one of the things they keep pointing out is that, sort of the popular science appearance of this stuff is very different from what it really is. So basically, when you're reading it in, on popular websites and stuff, and it's simplified down, they're really misusing and misrepresenting the research pretty significantly. And I think you see that in all science. I mean, because they're dumbing it down for the general public. They're trying to get something that sounds better than it really comes down to when you look at the actual facts behind it.
Yeah.
People have a belief in science rather than science.
Right. Right. And the people doing the actual science deep down there are not necessarily like that. They have a more balanced view of it, but they're not the ones who are addressing the public.
Yeah, there's probably no better example of that than Darwin's theory of evolution. The term survival of the fittest, which is probably not something that he actually wrote in his book, The Origin of Species, has been hijacked in order to justify, every kind of brutality, from eugenics to letting people amass obscene amount of fortune because they can, because they are, according to them, the fittest among our society.
Well, and Wallace was really who came up with all those discoveries anyway. And when you look at what Wallace was saying, he's like, well, if there's a shortage of food, then the ones least able to get the food are the ones that are going to die off. Not so much that the strongest are going to be the survivors. It's like, well, yes, but in a much broader way. It's not, if you have 10 different groups, one of them's likely to die off from lack of food. Not only one of them's going to survive.
Yeah.
And we actually have a free book up on wherethetheroadgo.com talking about the stuff that that Darwin stole from Wallace, and where Darwin got most of his ideas, backed by quite a bit of evidence. If you look in the free book section, it's there. I had the author on a couple of years ago. It was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
So, and his book apparently he had a bunch of them left, and he said, well, you know what? He's like, I'm not making any money out of it, so if you want, just put it up for people to download, because I don't care.
Cool.
So head over to the site if you want to check that out. It's well worth the read. All right. I thank all you guys for joining me. Let's go around here, and I'll start with Aaron. Where can people find you?
Charm the Water. I'm also, probably by the time this airs, going to have another podcast up called Goats Away.
Yay!
Yeah,
And what's that one going to be?
pure comedy. And Red Pill did the illustration, the artwork for it. It's really cool. I'm also working on a book on the goetic spirit seer, which I'm hoping to have out by January.
Nice. Tim?
I am at strangefamiliars.com. You can find both of my books on Amazon, Beyond the Seventh Gate and Bigfoot in Pennsylvania. My next book will be hopefully by the end of the year, but probably more likely in early 2018. And that will be another Bigfoot Wild Man book.
Nice.
Ooh.
And Red Pill?
Oh, you can find me in your dreams.
Ooh.
No. The Daily Grail, of course, Mysterious Universe, and absorbedbydesign.com, which is my own personal website.
All right. Thank you, guys. This has been great.
Thanks.
Thank
for
you.
having me.
You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.